My name is Valentine Low. The book is called Power and the Palace, and it's about the relationship between the government and the monarchy, kings, queens, and prime ministers, essentially, but also more than that, going back to Queen Victoria. And it's about how it's changed. Queen Victoria was an incredibly political monarch. She was always interfering. And then we get to Queen Elizabeth II, who really went out of her way to not interfere in politics.
So let's start with Victoria then. Can you just talk about Victoria's ascension to the throne and her initial relationship with her Prime Minister Melbourne?
So she was very young when she acceded to the throne. She was only recently turned 18, which was incredibly important because if she'd been under 18, she would have had to had a regent, and that would have been disastrous because of who it might have been. Her first prime minister was Lord Melbourne, who was a Whig, and he'd been around. I mean, he'd been prime minister before. He was, I think, 58, so he's 40 years older than her, old enough to be her grandfather. And she absolutely adored him. He was very much a father figure. I think she had a bit of a crush on him, really. And he guided her through being a monarch. He taught her how to be a monarch. And they had incredibly close contact. He used to see her all the time, every day. She would be based at Windsor Castle, and he would have an apartment for his use at Windsor, and he'd be at dinner sort of most nights sitting next to her, and if he wasn't at dinner she'd want to know where he was. So it was a very kind of close relationship, and when he lost power and he was no longer prime minister, she was very upset.
And how do you think that closeness informed relationships to prime ministers going forward?
Well, when Robert Peel took over, first of all, Robert Peel, who was a Tory, she didn't like Peel at all initially, and she used to communicate with Melbourne behind Peel's back, which was constitutionally a really dubious thing to do. But she's a very mercurial character, Victoria, and she was always changing her mind, and she actually came round to Peel at the end. But also Melbourne, she did slightly, not exactly go off him, but she began to lose her patience a bit with him. She could be a bit sharp with him if he didn't do something that she wanted him to do. But she'd always regret it afterwards because she had a deep underlying fondness for him. And there was a famous occasion when it's called the Bedchamber Crisis, and it was all about the ladies of the bedchamber, these essentially sort of ladies in waiting, or not quite that. It was much more a political world there, the palace. And when Robert Peel, this Tory, came in, he wanted to replace those ladies of the bedchamber who were essentially Whigs, married to Whigs, with some Tories. And she refused to do that. And it was a huge row, and she wouldn't back down because she was very stubborn, Victoria. And in the end, Peel said, well, I can't be prime minister if you won't do this. And the interesting point about this is that later in life, she regretted that. And she sort of slightly put the blame on Melbourne by saying that he was a very party political figure and he made her a party queen. I think this is unfair of her because I think it was her own stubbornness and failing to contemplate a compromise, because I think Peel would have compromised. There's no doubt about that. So I think it was her own fault. But she did say it was her own foolishness, but also slightly blamed Melbourne.
Another really interesting thing from the section of the book about Victoria is the extent of the influence that the monarch had on foreign affairs, or certainly tried to have on foreign affairs. Could you talk about that?
Everything was meant to go through the monarch. For instance, instructions to ambassadors abroad were meant to, in theory, were meant to come from the monarch. And when Lord Palmerston was Foreign Secretary, Victoria used to have frightful rows with him because he would essentially ignore her. He'd want to send his own instructions to ambassadors abroad and really didn't have time for going through the palace, and he'd make all sorts of excuses for the fact that he hadn't consulted her or consulted her too late. And she had strong opinions about foreign policy, not least, of course, because she was related to all these foreign heads of state. And when there was a war in Italy between Austria and, I think, from memory, the Kingdom of Sardinia, she got frightfully exercised about that and tried to influence the policy about that. Palmerston was Prime Minister at the time, and she had big rows with him about that. Also, the Crimean War and a later war between Russia and Turkey. She was vehemently anti-Russian and knocked heads with the government about policy, certainly with the Second Russian-Turkish War. in the 1870s. She was always having rows with and tried to go behind the backs of the government, behind the Prime Minister's back, to try and find out. She got a spy to tell her what was going on in cabinet meetings, because in those days the sovereign didn't get the cabinet minutes. Now, of course, they do. So she had to sort of recruit someone, a politician who was friendly towards her, to, on the sly, tell her what was going on in the cabinet. Extraordinary behaviour, all because she had such strong opinions, and she had particular differences with Palmerston about foreign policy, because he, at a time when a lot of sort of old sort of despotic regimes were being overthrown in Europe, Victoria was very much on the side of the old dynastic rulers, and Palmerston was very much on the side of the people rising up against them. And it led to quite serious difficulties in terms of policy.
And she actually threatened to abdicate, didn't she, over the Russia-Turkey war?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I think it wasn't the only time she threatened to abdicate, and I don't think she would have gone through with it. But it's extraordinary, this idea of a monarch threatening to abdicate over foreign policy.
And I suppose the one central theme throughout the entire book is the nature of our constitution and how it's changed. So just for the benefit of the audience, can you just explain, firstly, just what a constitution is, and also the nature of our constitution? So it's often called an uncodified constitution. Just explain what it is and what that means.
So the constitution is essentially the set of rules that govern how the country works. Everything from the appointment of prime ministers, how the courts work, everything to do with that. And people often say that we have an unwritten constitution, and as you have hinted, that's not entirely correct, because there are various bits of the constitution, the Bill of Rights and settlement, all sorts of things like that, which are in a way, and more recently the 2010 Cabinet Manual, which officially isn't really the constitution, but unofficially certainly is treated as though it's part of the constitution. But in terms of the monarch, the most important part of the constitution is how a prime minister is appointed. So a lot of it is based on precedents. It's a lot based on what has happened before. If you look how it's changed, when Victoria was on the throne and we needed a new prime minister, she would summon whoever she thought was appropriate, who might be able to have the confidence of the House of Commons. Now, they obviously had to have the confidence of the House of Commons. If they didn't, it wouldn't work, and she'd have to find another prime minister. But it was up to her to summon who she thought correct. And there was a time where we needed a new prime minister, and the obvious candidate was Lord Palmerston. And at that time, she hated Palmerston, basically didn't want to have him as prime minister at all. And she summoned 3 other people to see if they could form a government, and each of them couldn't. They just didn't have the support in the Commons. So that was how the constitution worked then. And when you come to Queen Elizabeth II, it worked an entirely different way. And there was a new cabinet manual that was written in 2010. Written by Gus O'Donnell with help from others. And that basically said that the politicians have to sort out between themselves who might be prime minister, then that person can go to the palace and be appointed by the Queen. So it's a question of the politicians deciding between themselves who will be it. It's just changed in this quite nebulous way over the decades, over the centuries. And it's all about precedents. It's all about what happened last time. And if things change, and things could change for all sorts of reasons, because of personalities, because of the political climate at the time, because someone's written a new cabinet manual. But once things change, they kind of remain changed. There's an interesting example of this, how things changed in 1922 when a new prime minister had to be appointed. And there was a choice between Lord Curzon, who's this sort of very experienced, old school kind of figure, but quite bombastic and not terribly popular. But he thought he was going to get the job, and Stanley Baldwin. And the King, George V, considered the possibility and decided that as Lord Curzon was in the House of Lords, he shouldn't be Prime Minister, and opted for Baldwin instead. And the interesting point, that wasn't really a convention at the time, and certainly Curzon didn't recognize that as a convention at the time. But it then sort of became a convention, and I found in the National Archives a memo from, I think, a couple of decades later, talking about how prime ministers are appointed, and this sort of cabinet office memo said, well, it appears this has probably become a convention now. It's rather hesitant language. They thought it was a convention, and now it absolutely is a convention. No one would consider having a prime minister from the House of Lords now, but things change because of events. And there was a wonderful instance. So the great historian Peter Hennessy, Lord Hennessy, once, I think this is in the 80s, bumped into some great sort of constitutional expert in the House of Commons, and they got chatting. And this chap said to Peter, "I've been thinking about the Constitution for 45 years now, and I've come to the conclusion that the Constitution is what happens." So, I mean, there it is. The Constitution is what happens.
Another of the themes of the book is this inverse relationship between the popularity of the government and the popularity of the monarchy. How did the unpopularity or disappearance of Victoria empower her various prime ministers in relationship to the power of the monarchy?
I think they were able to stick up for themselves more than they might have done otherwise. Because I think the unpopularity of the monarchy did lead to difficulties. There was a period in her reign when republicanism was definitely on the rise. There was quite a strong movement, and there was lots of sort of Republican magazines or newspapers and pamphlets and things like that. There were Republicans in the House of Commons who were quite vociferous. And I think that led to difficulties for her. But in a way, the bigger point is that although she tried to intervene in politics a lot of the time and was very meddlesome and basically made Prince Charles and his black spider memos look rather amateurish, I think but a lot of the time these politicians, they could have indulged and they humoured her, but they weren't necessarily going to change their policy because of her, despite her best efforts. I mean, she did try very hard. And it's quite hard to sort of come up with instances where she really affected things. There was this foreign secretary called Lord Clarendon who had a very kind of amusing attitude towards Victoria. He used to call her the Mrs., not to her face, behind her back. And when they had a disagreement, he'd say to his friend, those close to him, "The Mrs. and I have had a bit of a tiff."
One of the things that strikes me about the Victorian era is that it was much more scandalous than one would imagine. The stereotype of the Victorian era is that everything's kind of very uptight and very moralistic. But you mentioned in the book kind of quite extraordinary scandals, for example, with Melbourne and Palmerston. Palmerston's nickname was Cupid, I think, wasn't it?
Melbourne was definitely, there were wronged husbands who tried suing Melbourne, but he managed to win the cases. But yeah, he was definitely a ladies' man. And the story about Palmerston is absolutely extraordinary. So he becomes foreign secretary, and in her very early days, Victoria quite liked Palmerston because he basically taught her stuff. He taught her how to write to foreign heads of state, taught her about the world. But later, as we've discussed, she went off him because he basically wouldn't listen to her and had a very different attitude towards foreign policy to her. And there was one point when he's foreign secretary, when she and Albert tried to get rid of him. They tried to have him sacked. And one of the things they did, Albert was particularly behind this, he dredged up this scandal from more than a decade earlier, that when he'd been staying at Windsor Castle, he tried to force himself on a young woman at the bedchamber. He got into a room and sort of barricaded himself in. Fortunately, his efforts were unsuccessful, but they dredged this up again and said, surely a man with these terrible morals couldn't possibly be foreign secretary. And Lord John Russell was prime minister at the time, and he said, no, it's all a very long time ago, and he's a happily married man. I don't think it's appropriate to sack him. Which shows there was a different attitude to attempted rape then. I mean, that's what it was. He was an attempted rapist. Extraordinary.
Philip Ziegler has this brilliant description in the book called the Golden Triangle. Can you just explain what the Golden Triangle is and then go on to talk about that key relationship?
So the Golden Triangle is a phrase, as you say, dreamed up by Philip Ziegler, and it describes the relationship between the Sovereign's private secretary, the Prime Minister's principal private secretary at No.10, and the Cabinet Secretary. And those three people talk on a regular basis. It's very interesting. I once asked the great sort of constitutionalist Vernon Bogdanor about what he thought was the sort of most important leg of the Golden Triangle. And he said it was between the palace and the cabinet secretary, because the cabinet secretary is the senior figure, which and there's definitely an argument for that. But I would say the most important leg of it was actually between the private secretary of the palace and the private secretary at No.10, because they talk on a regular basis, much more regular basis. That they can talk every day, literally every day on the phone, and it's all, a lot of it is about making sure that they know what's happening, making sure there are no surprises, saying what's on their principal's mind, what's on the king and queen's mind, what's on the prime minister's mind, what's coming up. But sometimes they can also cook things up. So there was a fantastic example of that more recently, when at the beginning of COVID, when Boris Johnson is prime minister, and Boris wants to go and have his audience with the Queen, but most people think it's a bad idea because they suspect Boris has got COVID and they don't want him to go. They don't want Boris to give COVID to the Queen. But anyway, one of the ways that they try to stop him is that the Prime Minister's private secretary speaks to the Palace private secretary, who's Edward Young, and they agree that the Edward Young should tell the Queen that No.10 is having cold feet about coming for an audience in person. And the No.10 private secretary should tell Boris Johnson that the palace is having second thoughts about the Queen having an audience in person. Neither of which was true. But they thought by each side blaming the other, they'd managed to persuade their principals, the Queen and Boris Johnson, not to have this audience in person. They managed to succeed, but this idea that the two private secretaries cooked up a plan to slightly pull the wool over the eyes of their principals is a very interesting one, and shows the importance of that relationship.
And what about the role of leaks in this relationship between the palace and the prime minister? So we see this situation where one side leaks and the other side leaks. So you have an example in the book of Charles's team leaking his discussion about the succession and what would happen if it was a girl and if she married a guy called Mr. Smith, etc. How does that relationship play out? And when there is a leak from the palace, is it always with the authority of the principal that it is leaked?
No, I mean, certainly when there are leaks from the palace, and the phrase "from the palace" there is doing a lot of work, because is it an official briefing by the sort of press secretary to whichever role we're talking about? Is it someone being a bit too chatty? Is it some second-hand information that's come out? There are an awful lot of ways things get to the media, but sometimes these leaks definitely kind of, if not inspired by the royal in question, at least they have the connivance. So, for instance, going back a few years when Charles was Prince of Wales, and there was a Chinese state visit here, and he didn't go to the banquet, his press guy, Mark Bowler, let it be known that Charles was boycotting the banquet because of his views about Tibet, and it made quite a big story at the time. And it wasn't an instance of Charles telling Bolland to leak this. It was more Bolland saying, well, if I get asked these questions, I'll give these answers. And do you accept the consequences? And Charles sort of basically not telling him to desist. Whether he actually told him to leak it or tell the press that it, but he kind of knew what was probably going on and didn't try and stop it. I mean, that's how a lot of these things happen. But leaks, I mean, there was an example when Harry and Meghan was the thing, and the first news was starting to come out about Meghan feeling in a bad way, possibly her mental health was not good, she was under strain. And that came in a trailer to an ITV documentary. And Kensington Palace, which is where William was, they said after seeing the trailer of this documentary that William was, of course, concerned for his brother. And in Harry's mind, this became that they were briefing journalists about William's team was briefing journalists about Harry's mental state. This is outrageous. And it was nothing of the sort. It was them saying something expressing some concern and saying something quite obvious, but it was interpreted by Harry as a leak and as briefing. So often things which appear to be leaks aren't really leaks in the way that you or I might consider them. But the incident that you refer to with Charles and succession, I mean, that was very interesting. So what happened was this new law governing the rules of succession was going through, and it was allowing daughters to have the same rights as sons. And Charles had a meeting with the civil servant about something else and started grilling him about what this new law meant. And it wasn't really the civil servant's remit, but he answered the questions as best he could and didn't really think more of it. And then sort of some days later, 10 days later, whatever, basically an account of their conversation appeared on the front of the Daily Mail. And it was quite a partial account. It wasn't totally inaccurate, but it wasn't totally accurate either. And this caused a great deal of consternation in Whitehall. What's been going on? Now, did Charles leak that? Or did someone tell someone who told someone? I think it was a question of someone told someone, and it sort of got out that way. I don't think Charles would have deliberately, but in the view of Whitehall, he was guilty of having leaked it. And in the phrase of the cabinet secretary at the time, Charles was in the doghouse. They were not impressed.
One of the things I also found really interesting in your book is various stories of a kind of level of almost like contempt that the prime ministers have for the monarch. So, for example, David Lloyd George not turning up to meetings to George V. Could you just give us a few examples of that and just talk about its significance?
Yeah, I mean, Lloyd George was very dismissive of George V. He couldn't stand going up to Balmoral, so the whole place reeked of Toryism. Asquith, Lloyd George's Liberal predecessor, was very dismissive of George V. Basically thought he was dim, a very limited man, may not have been entirely wrong in that judgment. And there are other examples. I mean, certainly there was a sort of quite sticky relationship initially between Neville Chamberlain and George VI, sorry, but that did improve. But the point about all of this is that I think you can achieve so much more if you have a good relationship. So the example I give in the book is in the Second World War, Winston Churchill and George VI had an incredibly good relationship. Churchill shares with him all the sort of most top secret stuff, all the military secrets, including what was going on with the atomic bomb. I mean, George VI knew more about the atomic bomb than Clem Attlee, the Deputy Prime Minister, did. And George VI also connived with the plan to deceive the Germans about where D-Day would be. He helped with that. And then if you look back to the First World War and the relationship between Lloyd George and George V, the idea that any such collaboration happening between those two is simply non-credible. It simply couldn't have happened. So I think so much more can be achieved when there's a good relationship between monarch and prime minister. And you look more recently, King Charles and Sir Keir Starmer, I think they clearly have a good relationship. Charles is clearly trying very hard to be a helpful monarch. And we saw that when Charles agreed so readily to extend a second state visit to Donald Trump. Send an invitation to a second state visit to Donald Trump. It just shows more can be achieved with a harmonious relationship than otherwise.
Let's go to the abdication, because you talk about it in the book, and it's obviously an example of the power of ministers to kind of really show their teeth, and it demonstrates the power they have constitutionally. So can you just take us through that and just give us an idea of its significance in the context of the Constitution?
Yes, so Edward VIII comes to the throne in January 1936. He's had a string of mistresses before this, but he is carrying on, has been carrying on for some time with Wallis Simpson, who is married. She's American, and she's already been divorced once, and she looks set on being divorced again from Ernest Simpson. And the King's private secretary, Alec Harding, writes to No.10 saying, you've got to do something about this. It was later regarded by Edward VIII as a great act of betrayal, this. Baldwin goes to see Edward VIII at his home in Windsor, Fort Belvedere, and tries to explain to him that this simply won't do. The country won't bear it. I mean, there were very different attitudes to divorce then. And his chief aim is to try and persuade him to persuade Mrs. Simpson not to be divorced from her husband. This is looming on the horizon, the divorce, Mrs. Simpson's second divorce, and he thinks it'll be scandalous, and it'll obviously open the possibility of marriage between those two, and he just wants to stop it. And he puts the case to Edward VIII, and Edward VIII says rather disingenuously, just because Mrs. Simpson is a friend of the king doesn't mean to say I can stop her doing anything. Absolutely ludicrous thing to say. Anyway, there's a lot of back and forth, and the king is set on marrying this woman. The cabinet is absolutely adamant that he shouldn't. There's no way that the country would wear it for the king to be married to twice divorced American. And there's a great impasse, neither side's giving way. And then basically it becomes quite apparent. There's an attempt at a compromise. Someone, we think it's Winston Churchill, comes up with this idea of what's called a morganatic marriage. And a morganatic marriage is where you marry someone, but someone of high status marries someone of lower status, and the person of lower status doesn't get the kind of full title that they might otherwise get. So in other words, she wouldn't be called the Queen. They thought they could do that, but that won't wash either. And in the end, the king is forced to decide about whether marrying Mrs. Simpson or remaining on the throne. It's incredibly important for many, many reasons, because it showed the kind of dominance of the cabinet. It shows that they have the whip hand. The elected government of this country can say to the king what happens and what doesn't happen. And it set the tone for the second half of the 20th century in terms of the relationship between monarch and prime minister.
And it's interesting, isn't it? One of the thought experiments I often think about is what would have happened if the Queen had died in, say, 2000? So if the Queen had died when Charles hadn't married Camilla, especially during that period when he was so unbelievably unpopular that even Andrew was trying to kind of finagle his way to become the king if the Queen had died with characteristic modesty. Do you think that there would have been a constitutional crisis if Charles had ascended to the throne without being married to Camilla? One of the points you make in the book is the fact that the abdication crisis creates this convention that the cabinet has a say over who the monarch can marry. So do you think that had the Queen died earlier, there could potentially have been a constitutional crisis there?
And that's a very interesting question, because one of the great things that the royal family did, one of the clever things, was that the Queen basically bestowing her blessing on Camilla during the Platinum Jubilee by saying that it was her wish that she should become known as Queen Consort. Like a ludicrous phrase which survived for about 6 months when on the throne and then was dropped. And I was very pleased. I was working for the Times at the time, and the person in charge of house style, how things get phrased on the paper, thought this phrase Queen Consort was ridiculous and the Times shouldn't use it, and we'd just call her the Queen. She was the Queen. And I was absolutely couldn't be more pleased to obey this diktat within the Times. And I always in my copy called her the Queen or Queen Camilla. And behold, some 6 months later, Buckingham Palace followed suit by letting it be known that they were going to call her the Queen from now on. So where the Times led, Buckingham Palace followed. But yeah, I mean, you pose an interesting question. I think it would have been much more difficult. I don't think it led to a constitutional crisis, because I don't think the government would have stood in the way of Charles marrying who he wanted to marry. But it could have caused difficulty, and a lot of it would have depended on Charles's popularity at the time. But the whole thing with Camilla was they played a very long game. There was a long game in sort of the PR game of basically winning over the British public, so she was no longer seen as this wicked woman who broke up the marriage, but virtues could be seen instead, because she's a wonderful woman in many ways, and those who met her are all big fans. I'm a big fan of Camilla. I think she's great. But it took a while to win over some elements of the British public. And the other thing that the palace did, which was interesting, or Clarence House did, to be precise, they played a long game about what title she'd use. So the original line, when they got married, the line was always that the Camilla would be called, when he ascended to the throne, Camilla would be called Princess Consort. Some people thought this is nonsense. They didn't believe it, but that was official palace line. And then I remember I was on a train. I believe there was a royal engagement in Birmingham, I think. We were all chatting, the royal correspondents, and one of them was happened to be looking at the Clarence House website, and they noticed that the kind of paragraph on the website where it used to say when they marry, Camilla will be Princess Consort. That paragraph had disappeared from the website. We all thought it was absolutely fascinating and immediately started grilling Clarence House for what's this mean? And they came out with this absolute nonsense. Oh, it's nothing. It's just a technical thing. We're redesigning the website. It's nothing to see here, nothing to read into this. And not one of us believed a single word of what they were saying. We all knew that they were up to something, that they were trying to prepare the ground for not being Princess Consort when they married. So yeah, which is all a long way of saying the palace plays a long game about these things, and they try and prepare the ground. At least when they're being clever, they try and prepare the ground. So I think in the scenario that you describe about the Queen dying before Charles had married Camilla, I think the ground preparation would have been difficult and it would take a long time. But if they'd been sent, they wouldn't have tried to provoke a crisis by saying he's marrying her tomorrow and she's going to be queen, and everyone say, "Oh my God, you can't do that. She's a wicked woman." They would have played it out over years.
Well, let's talk about Camilla then. There's an astonishing story in your book about Camilla. Can you just take us through that?
Yeah. So this story dates back. Well, the emergence of this story dates back to when Boris Johnson was first mayor of London. So when he becomes mayor of London, he gets invited to meet the Prince of Wales, goes over to Clarence House. He's late because, amazingly, he and his press guy, Gita and Harry, get on the tube at City Hall and get on the tube going in the wrong directions. They have to get off the tube and get on another one coming back into town. And you would have thought that the mayor of London knew how to use the London Underground, but clearly not. Anyway, sometime after that, Camilla says, "Oh, this Boris Johnson, he looks like fun. Can we have him for tea?" So she has him for tea. No Charles this time. And this time, Boris and Gita go by bicycles to make sure they're not late. Camilla's absolutely astonished they go by bicycle and sort of meets them in the bike shed at Clarence House and says, "I couldn't believe it. They told me you're going on a bike. I couldn't believe it." Anyway, sort of grabs Boris by the elbow and takes him off upstairs to have tea while Gita has tea with the private secretary. And clearly, Boris and Camilla get on like a house on fire. He comes down from tea, absolutely sort of singing her praises. They've had, as well as having a nice chat, they've had a serious conversation because he, at that time, wanted to set up some rape crisis centres around London. And she was all very in favour of that because she was very strong on campaigning against domestic violence, domestic abuse, sexual violence, all that. And she tells him the story about how when she was a teenager, she was on a train going to London, I think, and she's a schoolgirl, and some guy starts groping her, and his hand is, on a skirt or a knee or whatever. And Boris is sort of absolutely aghast at this, obviously, as anyone would be, and says, "Well, what did you do?" And Camilla says, "Well, I did what my mother taught me. I took my shoe off and whacked him in the nuts with a heel." Which is, it's also a wonderful story, but in a way I like the way the story ends, because then when Camilla gets to the station, wherever it is, Paddington, she finds a man in uniform and tells him what's happened, and this miscreant is arrested. So not only does Camilla have the sort of robustness to whack this guy with her shoe, but then she has the kind of strength of character and the sort of sense of civic responsibility to get him arrested at the end of the journey. It reflects incredibly well on Camilla. It's a fantastic story. But yes, it took years to come out.
And I'm interested in these kind of stories. Would there be any kind of permission from the palace for Gita Harry to tell that kind of story? I mean, how does a story like this come out in terms of, does he just tell you and you say, "I'm going to put it in the book," or is there kind of something behind the scenes of the palace subtly saying, "Yeah, we don't mind that story being told"?
Well, what I can say, and I'm going to choose my words slightly carefully if you don't mind. None of this goes through Gita's. Well, what goes through Gita's mind is he thinks the story's already out there. When he told me that story, he says, "I think this is known." And I'm thinking to myself, I'm not sure it is. I'm really not sure it is. And I go and check. And then, obviously, in the law, victims of yeah, sexual abuse are entitled to lifelong anonymity. So, obviously, I spoke to Buckingham Palace about this, and all I can say is I published the story. And you might have seen briefings in various papers. Anonymous palace sources said things like, well, the Queen has never told the story in public herself, but if some benefit comes out of it now in terms of other women, girls see that there's no shame or stigma to attach to being a victim of these things. And if by sharing the story, makes it easier for someone else to share, to tell their story or to come forward or to report it, that might be a positive to emerge out of all of this. That those briefings, I think, give you an idea of what the palace's attitude towards this, and more importantly, what the Queen's attitude to all of this is.
Let's talk about Thatcher and the Queen, because I think it's a really, really interesting relationship. And there's all sorts of fascinating anecdotes in your book. And it's quite a confusing relationship in a way, isn't it? Because on the one hand, they're quite frosty with each other and they don't necessarily get on very well. But by the end of Thatcher's life, the Queen shows her extraordinary kindness and respect. Just give us an idea of Thatcher and the Queen's relationship.
I think the important thing, well, first, there are several important things to make clear about Thatcher Queen. The first is, I don't think the Queen hated Margaret Thatcher. So anything you may have seen in The Crown, I think you have to take that with a pinch of salt. I think she was exasperated by her. I think she said she wouldn't listen. And I think that's the view of the Queen about many of her prime ministers. Actually, they won't listen. But I think importantly, there are kind of two very different dimensions to the Queen Thatcher relationship. One is the kind of personal, social, sort of human aspect of it. So Margaret Thatcher had this sort of exaggerated respect for the royal family. So she was always a little kind of awkward in the Queen's presence. She would kind of curtsy incredibly low when she saw the Queen. I mean, to the extent to which there were sort of courtiers in Buckingham Palace who thought this was all very funny. And I think Margaret Thatcher was often quite nervous about her audiences. She used to leave Buckingham Palace, which is only sort of 5-minute drive, if that, incredibly early, just in case there was bad traffic, because she didn't want to be late. She was quite nervous. Robin Butler, the former cabinet secretary and also private secretary at No.10, he was Thatcher's private secretary for a while, and he would often would usually accompany Margaret Thatcher to the palace for her audiences, because the convention is the private secretary goes with the PM, and then while the PM is with the Queen upstairs in the audience room, the private secretary would go to the Queen's private secretary's office and have a glass of sort of warm white wine, would be sort of pumped for information by the private secretary, and Thatcher would join them after the audience. Thatcher would join them, and Robin Butler has said she always needed a large whiskey afterwards because she'd been so nervous during the audience, and she just wasn't a country. They had nothing in common on a personal level. I mean, there's no idea of the sisterhood. So Margaret Thatcher just wasn't a countrywoman in the way the Queen was a countrywoman. So on her first visit to Balmoral, which I think when she was Education Secretary rather than as Prime Minister, she simply didn't have the right shoes for going for country walks and had to be lent a pair of shoes and sort of extra socks to make them fit. And kind of famously, there's a thing about they often have a barbecue at Balmoral, and the Queen likes to do the washing up. And Margaret Thatcher was astonished, appalled at the idea the Queen washed up without gloves. And when she got back down to Downing Street, she sent a pair of marigolds up to Balmoral for the Queen's use. So there's that element. There's the kind of personal element. They just weren't on the same wavelength. Then there's the kind of political, and so the Queen regarded the Commonwealth, of which she was head, as incredibly important. As Margaret Thatcher sort of couldn't stand the Commonwealth. She used to get a lot of stick in the Commonwealth because of the government's policy, mainly about South Africa. A lot of people wanted Britain to impose sanctions on the apartheid regime in South Africa, and Margaret Thatcher thought this was a bad idea. She thought it would hurt the people they're trying to help. It would hurt ordinary black South Africans. So there was there were political differences there. And the miners' strike, that was another bone of contention. It's not that the Queen was pro the miners or anything like that, but she was very concerned at the divisive nature of the strike and how the country was being divided, and she thought it was having a very bad effect on communities, and she was very concerned. So they definitely had political differences, but I don't think they had political rows or anything like that. But they were not necessarily on the same team. But the Queen, I think, would always have behaved with sort of constitutional rectitude, and she knew she always acted on prime ministerial advice. That's what monarchs do. They act on prime ministerial advice. They do what the prime minister tells them to do. But there were significant differences between the two of them, and there was one very funny story when the Queen was at a Commonwealth summit with, I think it was the one that was in Zambia and Lusaka, and she was with the president of Lusaka, and they were at a reception, and she's talking to the Zambia president, Kaunda, and she says, "My friend, I should be careful. We are being observed by the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom." And Kaunda looked over there, and there was Thatcher glaring at them. So they were good. But when Thatcher resigned as Prime Minister, the Queen made her a member of the Order of Merit, which is in her gift. Only 24 members at any one time. It was a great honour. The Queen also invited her to the races, but Thatcher did not accept that invitation to go to the races. And then there's this very touching thing. Well, and also when Thatcher died, the Queen went for a funeral. The Queen never goes to funerals. It was a singular honour, that it really was. But also when Thatcher turned 80, there was a birthday party for her at the Mandarin Oriental Hotel, and all sorts of great and good were there. Joan Collins, Lloyd Melbourne, Tony Blair, everyone was there. And Thatcher was beginning to lose it by then. The dementia was beginning to kick in. And the Queen took her by the arm and sort of guided her around the party, talking to people. It was a very sort of touching image, these two grandmothers going around. So, I think she respected her as a prime minister, definitely. And the idea of any kind of hatred or bitterness or acrimony, I think, is exaggerated. But they were not bonded.
There's a good quote in your book, and it's a Tony Blair quote, and he says the Queen got on with two types of people: sort of authentic Labour people, or people who are a bit like her. But the people in the middle, she didn't get on with so well. People he described as a bit nouveau, a bit Arabiste. Do you think that's a fair description?
I think there's an element of truth in that, certainly. I think it's often a question of who feels comfortable in the royal presence. So those who are used to it feel comfortable in it. But you can also have people from very humble backgrounds, very working class backgrounds, who are absolutely sure of who they are, and they just treat the Queen like another person. So you think of her dresser, Angela Kelly, this Liverpudlian who's the daughter of a sort of dockyard crane operator, had a wonderful relationship with the Queen. And it goes back over history. There are many monarchs who have these very strong, interesting relationships with sort of very working class Labour figures. So George V had a very good relationship with Ramsay MacDonald, his first Labour Prime Minister, and also a chap called Jimmy Thomas, who's this Welsh former railwayman, former railway union official, very working class, but had a fantastic relationship with George. And later George VI had a great relationship with Ernest Bevin, who in the post-war Attlee government became Foreign Secretary. He came from the West Country, working class background, had a fantastically warm, positive relationship with George VI. At one point, the King's equerry, actually a significant one, a group captain Peter Townsend, who wanted to marry Princess Margaret but didn't, he expressed criticism of Bevin, who to the King for keeping his hand in his pocket when he shook hands. So, one hand in his pocket, the other hand shaking hands. Well, this is a very casual, inappropriate way of behaving. And George said, "I don't care. He's a proper Englishman and I like him."
One of the things that I find really interesting in the book, and actually slightly shocking as well, is this notion of Queen's consent and the way that it's been used in the last kind of 50 or 60 years by the Queen and Prince Charles. So, for example, you give the example of the I think it was the Shareholders Act, or it was a piece of law where the Queen's private secretary lobbied for it not to be relevant to her. And there was also reporting a few years ago that Buckingham Palace lobbied not to be included in the Civil Rights Act in the 60s. Could you just explain what Queen's consent is and talk us through some of the examples where it sails quite close constitutionally to the wind?
So Queen's consent, or now King's consent, it's a parliamentary convention, first of all. And what it says is that the monarch's consent is sought for any bit of legislation that would affect the Crown's prerogatives or interests, including hereditary revenues and personal property. And there are various examples of this. For instance, back in 1973, the Queen's personal lawyer lobbied the Heath government to change a draft law that would have disclosed details of her private share dealings. And when this came up, The Guardian revealed this a few years ago. And when it came up, the palace said Queen's consent is a parliamentary process with the role of the sovereign purely formal. Consent is always granted by the monarch where requested by government. Any assertion that the sovereign has blocked legislation is simply incorrect. I think they're a little disingenuous there, because a lot of it happens in the kind of the discreet to and fro between the palace and the government beforehand. And there was one very interesting example, because there was also prince's consent. It also applied to the Prince of Wales. And there was one really interesting example that in 1992, Charles applied pressure on ministers to stop some of his tenants in a village in Cornwall, in the village of Newton St Low, from having the right to buy their own homes. And ministers thought quite rightly there was no reason why Charles's tenants shouldn't have the same rights as tenants anywhere else in the country. But they backed down. The government backed down in order to avoid a major row with the prince, which they feared could lead to a constitutional crisis. And as you say, the Liberal Democrat MP Norman Baker described Queen's consent as a constitutional outrage. Now, I think a lot of the examples aren't outrageous. I mean, I think they're quite obscure stuff. And what I do think, and I think people like Norman Baker do get slightly overexercised about this, but I've got a very, I think, simple solution to this, is if you made it all public, if you made those exchanges between the government and the palace about consent public, most of the problem would disappear, because the palace would be a lot more circumspect about opposing things if they knew it was going to come out immediately. A bit of daylight on these things solves most problems, in my opinion.
Yes, the best disinfectant. That opens up the question, doesn't it? How jealously does the royal family guard its archives? And how much do you think remains unknown of 20th century royal history?
The palace guards its archives extremely assiduously. Lots of writers have complained about the failure to get access to interesting documents, and nothing of any interest from the late Queen Elizabeth's reign has been disclosed. I mean, when I was doing this book, I asked the Royal Archives for access to one or two things shedding light on the previous reign, and they said no, because Queen Elizabeth's papers have not been opened up yet. Much easier to get stuff from them from the Georgian, the Victorian era. But also you have the problem of the royal family themselves, who are very good at destroying material. I mean, Queen Victoria's daughter burnt her diaries, copied out a sort of sanitized version of them, which is what one can consult now, but she destroyed them. They are very keen on ensuring that their version of history is one that reflects well on the family, and they are prepared to go to some lengths to make sure of that. It's fascinating. And were I to be writing a new book, I might be making further applications to the Royal Archives, and I'll have to see how I get on. The other great source of information is Alistair Campbell's diaries. Endless volumes of these diaries, huge, great, fat works, but they're but also what's interesting about them is that they're quite honest. I get a quite interesting sequence in the book all about Alistair Campbell's crush on Princess Diana. And most, not all of it, but most of that is from Alistair Campbell's own diaries. What's fascinating is stuff which gets overlooked. We're getting, well, actually, it's not totally off piste at all. But a few years ago, there was a documentary on Channel 4 about how George VI helped the war effort, and in particular, the thing I've already referred to of helping in the operation to deceive the Germans about where D-Day was. And some royal documentaries on television aren't very good. They overstate their case. They don't have anything particularly new. And I was still at the Times then. I was trying to work out how new a story this was, how true the story was. And there was a writer who knows, I'm not going to name, who knows all about this area. And this writer said to me, "Oh, I'm not sure this is true. I mean, the plot to deceive the Germans was one of the greatest kept secrets of the war, and the military intelligence took a long time to trust George VI. I'm not sure they would have entrusted this secret with him. I mean, I'm not sure this is true at all." Anyway, so I rang up one of the historians who was behind this program and quizzed them about it, and they say, "Oh no, it's absolutely true. It's in Tommy Lascelles' diary." Tommy Lascelles, Sir Alan Lascelles, private secretary to George VI. His diaries had been published some years earlier. They were available in all good bookshops. And you go to the entry for whatever it is of March 1944, and there it is in black and white in Tommy Lascelles' diary. He uses this fantastic phrase about how the men from MI, military intelligence, MI5 or MI6, the men from MI came around to the palace to discuss how we could bamboozle the Germans. And it's there in black and white, and everyone for at least 5 or 6 years had missed this story, which was just sitting there. And I had another example of this. There was a story in another book, a previous book, about the Queen's Christmas broadcasts. Basically, how in the broadcast just before we joined the EEC, as it was then, the Queen's Christmas broadcast is normally, it's not on government advice, it's her own thing. But because she was going to mention the EEC, there was back and forth between No.10 and the palace about what she would say about Europe, and it was kind of that was a story in another book. I went to look at the file myself in the National Archives in Kew, because I thought I'll read it myself. And I was flicking through this file, and I flicked to the next year, which was Heath government, just before the 3-day week was introduced. So the industrial disputes going on, the coal crisis. Heath introduced a 3-day week to preserve energy. And I found this other story sitting there in the archives. So clearly this is an archive which had been thumbed through by other people. And they'd missed this story about how the Queen wanted to say something about the 3-day week. And basically Edward Heath wouldn't let her. And she pressed the issue through her private secretary. She pressed it, said, "Oh, well, if I can't say something again, perhaps I can say something at the beginning." And again, Heath said no. And it's so the brilliant story all about how the Queen was desperate to say something, quite bland. She would have said something incredibly innocuous, but this is a difficult time for all of us. I'm thinking of you, that sort of thing. And Heath simply wouldn't let her say anything. And this story was sitting there in the archives that had been totally missed. So there's all sorts of things out there.
Let's talk about Diana and that whole episode, because you're really interesting when it comes to this story. And you talk about the fact that the general story is that Alistair Campbell and Tony Blair saved the monarchy. And you talk about why it's a bit more subtle than that. And you quote the palace, for example, calling it the great Alistair Campbell takeover. Tell us that story and tell us what's new in your book concerning that.
Yeah, I mean, that story is kind of interesting. So when Diana died, obviously it was a great crisis for everyone. On the day, actually, it's literally the day she died. So she died early on Sunday morning, didn't she? And later that day, when her body is being flown back from Paris to RAF Northolt, someone from the palace says to Alistair Campbell, I think, "It would be really helpful if you came to a meeting at the palace tomorrow." And Campbell decides to bring 1 or 2 other people with him. including Angie Hunter, Tony Blair's gatekeeper, she's always referred to as, because, and it's interesting that he says that because he says, I can bring a kind of tabloid mentality. I understand how things go down with the sort of tabloid market. And Angie Hunter has the kind of Middle England sensibility. So she understands how Middle England sees all these things. And there's no doubt that the Blair government helped shape the palace response, in a good way, in a beneficial way. But also what gets overlooked is the extent to which a lot of what happened was actually down to the palace. So, for instance, because the palace recognised that Diana's funeral would have to be different. They weren't stupid. They realised this would have to be a different kind of royal funeral. And in fact, the idea of the charity representatives following behind the funeral cortege was actually a palace idea. So it's not all brilliant new Labour telling the palace how to save themselves. It's more complicated than that. But the interesting thing, that one of the things I found really fascinating, so you get to the middle of that week, but so a few days after the death, a few days before the funeral, things are going quite badly. There's a lot of public criticism. Obviously, there's a lot of criticism of the press, but also a lot of criticism about the palace and the palace response. The palace is pretty unpopular. There are a couple of issues. There's the ridiculous issue of the flag flying over the palace. Shouldn't it be at half-mast? That's what the people wanted. And also the Queen was up in Balmoral. She was still up in Balmoral. She hadn't come down to London. And she also hadn't addressed the nation. And a lot of people thought she should come down. A lot of people thought she should talk to the people. Tony Blair wanted to say all this to the Queen, and he'd only been Prime Minister for a few months. He hadn't been Prime Minister at all long, but he'd had audiences with the Queen and all that, but he felt he didn't know the Queen well enough to say all this to her. So what he did was that he had a conversation on the phone with Charles, who he knew better and had a stronger relationship with, and also was closer in age to. And he said all this to Charles, and fortunately, Charles agreed with him and was able to pass that message on to the Queen and reinforce that message to the Queen. And of course, she did come down to London, she did address the nation, she did meet the crowds, slightly saved the day. But it's a fascinating reflection of Blair's relationship with the Queen, that he felt he didn't know her well enough to speak with quite the frankness that he wanted to speak to her. Absolutely fascinating. And I spoke to a person at the palace who felt, certainly at that period, that early period, I think the Queen felt Blair was still new, was still young, still had things to learn. He was probably her favourite Prime Minister, but I don't think she hated him. I think she understood where he was coming from. They were tumultuous times. He pushed through a lot of changes, the House of Lords and all that, which the palace's attitude to that was quite interesting in that they recognised that the Blair government had a strong mandate, they had a strong majority, and they had every right to do all this. And the palace would just monitor things, and they certainly wouldn't stand in anyone's way.
There's a really interesting chapter in your book, and you talk about a phone call with Peter Mandelson that has a hugely significant effect on our constitution. Can you just talk about that?
Yeah. So Prince Charles has several run-ins with the Labour government. And in particular, he writes an article for the Daily Mail about genetically modified produce, GM foods, GM crops. And it gets quite an inflammatory headline. This was at the time when the Mail was campaigning about Frankenstein foods, as they call them. And this goes down incredibly badly with the government, who is trying to allay fears about GM crops. And they think it's unscientific, they think it's unhelpful, they think he's gone too far. But interestingly enough, Blair doesn't pick a public fight with Charles about this. There's no No.10 briefings about the article. But what Blair does is he gets Peter Mandelson, who has a relationship with Charles. He's had meetings with him. He gets Peter Mandelson to talk to Charles. And Peter Mandelson, he rings him on his mobile from a traffic jam in New York. Basically tells him he's overstepped the mark. And I just think it's really interesting because Charles has always said, "Oh, I know the difference between Prince of Wales and being sovereign." And I paraphrase, but essentially what he says is that when I become king, I won't be meddlesome because I know the difference between the two jobs. And I've always asked the question, well, what is the difference between the two jobs? Who says what a Prince of Wales can do and what a sovereign can do? And it's nowhere. And my view is that Charles just made it up and pushed it as far as he could, and until the Peter Mandelson phone call. And the Peter Mandelson phone call has been mentioned before. It's in Mandelson's own memoirs, but no one's ever paid any attention to it or pointed out the significance. And I think it's incredibly significant because it represents the first time that a government has pushed back on the royal family, on the Prince of Wales, and saying, actually, politically, this time you've gone too far. You can't do this. You can't say that. And I think Charles, he didn't change his views as a result of what Peter Mandelson said, but I think he might have at least temporarily modified his behaviour. And it's just so significant, the government saying, here's a line. We're drawing the line here, and this is where you've crossed it.
The Queen makes a comment during the Scottish referendum, which at the time is seen as a casual offhand comment, although it is obviously taken very seriously. You lay out in your book that it's anything but. Can you just take us through that story?
So the Scottish independence referendum, David Cameron thinks it's all fine, it's going to be won, the Scots are not going to vote for independence. And then about a week or so before the actual referendum, there's an opinion poll in the Sunday Times which shows the two sides running neck and neck, and Cameron panics. And as he said once in an interview, he wanted the palace to just raise an eyebrow a quarter of an inch. And there's a plan cooked up between the private secretary at No.10, Jeremy Hayward, who has since died, Christopher Geidt, the private secretary of Buckingham Palace, and they cook up a plan. And the plan involves the Queen going to church on the Sunday before the referendum. And she was asked by someone what she thought about the referendum. And she says she just hopes that the Scottish people will think very carefully. And it is a brilliantly worded message because she says nothing and she says everything. She doesn't express an opinion, but everyone knows what she means. It's fantastically clever. And I mean, I know a little bit more than I was able to put into the book, but it really was a plan cooked up, and the Queen connived in it. And the Queen, she essentially had a script. She had a phrase that she was going to use, and she used it. And some people in the palace thought this was a big mistake. They thought the Queen was getting involved in politics and it would come back to bite them later. And in a sense, it did with Brexit, which may be your next question.
Yes, indeed. So around the time of Brexit, famously, The Sun had this big splash whereby they said the Queen was a Brexiteer. And in your book, you argue that she was a Remainer. Can you just explain what happened there?
So the Sun story, Queen backs Brexit. This was based on a lunch that happened, I think, 5 years earlier, in which the Queen had said things about the EU, such as, I really don't understand the EU. And apparently she said this with venom and emotion. The Sun got its knuckles wrapped over that because they said the headline was not justified by the copy. And indeed, how could it be? The copy described a lunch 5 years earlier before there was even a referendum, and the Queen certainly wasn't expressing opinion that we should leave the EU. I spoke to a minister who told me that they had a conversation with the Queen during the referendum campaign, in which the Queen said, I don't think we should leave the EU, better stick with the devil. And that seems pretty unequivocal to me. Now, this is not to say that the Queen was a flag-waving Remainer or flag-waving Europhile. I think she was exasperated by the EU, but as someone else from the palace explained to me, she felt the EU was part of the kind of post-war settlement, nations cooperating with each other. For all she tore her hair out at this EU bureaucracy. She thought in the end it was better to stick with the status quo. In my view, I think there's no doubt that if the Queen had a vote, which she didn't, if the Queen had a vote, she would have voted Remain. She would have been a reluctant Remainer, I think, but a lot of people who voted Remain were reluctant Remainers, but absolutely no doubt about it. But this bit of information did reach David Cameron's ears, and he had to decide what to do about it. And he decided, I think quite rightly, not to use it in the campaign. Now, clearly, the Leave camp had no compunction whatever about giving this story to the Sun, which they thought bolstered their case, Queen backs Brexit. It's very interesting to consider what would happen if there'd been another headline saying Queen backs Remain without have made any difference. Fascinating. Who knows?
How do you think Charles is faring as king?
I think I always thought I have been critical about Charles in the past, but I always thought he'd do better than people thought, and I think that's proved right. I think he's done pretty well. He's gone out of his way to behave. He's been a good constitutional king. He certainly has abandoned his old habits. He doesn't make controversial speeches anymore. Although his speeches have a little more content than the late Queen's did, I think. There's just a little bit more bite to them. He doesn't write black spider memos to ministers anymore. And we saw the way that he cooperated. Well, when he wasn't allowed to go to COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh, he didn't make a fuss about that. He was desperate to go, but he absolutely didn't make a fuss about that. He was very cooperative about the signing of the Windsor Framework, which wasn't signed in Windsor Castle. It was signed at a hotel, but he was very present. And the fact that it was all associated with Windsor, that was run past the palace, and they thought in the end it was okay. And I think that was interesting example of Charles helping the government as he's meant to do, without getting involved in anything politically controversial. They were very concerned that the Windsor Framework shouldn't be politically controversial, as indeed it didn't prove to be. It passed through Parliament with a massive majority. Basically, everyone backed it, apart from a few dissidents. And then, as I've mentioned before, with the Trump state visit, Charles and Trump, they're not ideological bedmates. Their views on climate change and all the rest of it are very different. But Charles went out of his way to be incredibly welcoming. He knows that Trump is a great admirer of the royal family. And so Charles rolled out the red carpet, including the absolute absurdity of having a carriage drive through the grounds of Windsor when there's no members of the public to see them. The whole point of a carriage drive is to be seen by the public. But if the public aren't there, what's the point? The point is to flatter Donald Trump's ego, and that's what they did.
Yeah, it was a real emperor has no clothes moment. But even without the crowd telling him he doesn't have any clothes, it'd be interesting to see how William fares, won't it? Because he seems to me that he's going down the kind of bicycle, what do they call them, cycling monarchies, or
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
whether that will work or not, it'd be interesting to see. Because I feel like William's not particularly interested in politics, and that might work in his favour, perhaps.
He's certainly not interested in politics in the way that his father was, but he's got views. Hence that statement he released on Gaza, which was very carefully worded, straight down the middle, and didn't contradict in any way government policy, but still, some people still criticise William for it. But he felt so strongly he wanted to say something.